She walked into light as if the cameras had been waiting just for her. For a few brief years, the lenses made her radiance permanent. Audiences learned the shape of her laughter and the angle of her face. Barbara Payton was born in 1927 and, for a time, belonged to the screen. She rose fast, then fell faster. A comet burned down to a cold ember. The ledger records a life that began and ended in neat dates, 1927 to 1967. But the space after that small dash has its own, stranger silence. Official traces describe a final administrative settling, a death certificate, a record of cremation, and entries that point to a resting place in San Diego. Yet even as those entries exist, the shape of a proper memorial, a stone, a public grave photograph, a clear family record of custody for her ashes, is not loudly present in the story most people remember. That absence feels less like paperwork and more like a question. This is not a plea for scandal. It is an invitation to listen to what silence can tell. When a performer who once filled rooms of strangers leaves so little that can be touched or visited, the omission itself becomes a mystery. Did procedure fail her? Was she lost among the unclaimed and unnamed? Or did the industry that made a name quietly allow that name to dissolve, down to the last physical trace? The camera turned away once, now the lens will look back, patiently, into that quiet place between record and remembrance.
She was born far from the noise of studios and marquees, in a place where the horizon felt wide and uncomplicated, and where a young girl could imagine herself into anything she wished. Barbara Payton grew up in Texas, wrapped in the kind of early beauty that drew attention without her trying. People noticed her. They always did. Even before Hollywood, she carried the raw material of a star, a striking face, a restless energy, and a confidence that felt older than her years. But beneath that brightness was a hunger, not for fame yet, but for movement, for escape, for something larger than the quiet routines around her. She pushed boundaries early, bending rules in ways that made her unforgettable to some and unsettling to others. The small towns she lived in were too small for her temperament, too narrow for her ambition. Her childhood wasn't tragic. It wasn't broken. It was uncontained. And that uncontained nature, the same spark that would propel her onto studio lots and casting couches, would also, one day, make her vulnerable to a world that rewards impulsiveness only as long as it can be sold. The girl who grew up dreaming under open skies would later die with no marked place under the earth. And understanding the promise of her beginnings makes the silence at her ending feel even more chilling.
Hollywood embraced her quickly, almost too quickly. Barbara Payton arrived with a face the studios could market, a presence they could polish, and a fire they believed they could control. In the early 1950s, she moved from hopeful newcomer to leading lady with a velocity that made her difficult to ignore. Directors wanted her intensity, publicists wanted her beauty, audiences wanted the enigmatic mix of innocence and danger she carried so naturally. But Hollywood never grants such things without cost. The same passion and impulsiveness that made her magnetic on screen made her unpredictable off it. Her relationships became headlines, her nightlife became gossip, and her private choices became weapons wielded by the press. And in the Hollywood of that era, a star did not need to commit a crime to be punished. A star only needed to fall out of the industry's preferred narrative. Barbara fell hard, fast, publicly. Roles thinned. Studios stepped back. The spotlight that had once chased her began to treat her like a shadow that refused to fade. By the mid-1950s, the ascent was over, and the descent had begun, a long, painful unraveling of opportunities, dignity, and stability. This is the part of her story people remember most, the scandals, the fights, the self-destruction. But what they rarely remember is this: the system that built her had already abandoned her years before her final tragedy, and that abandonment would echo in a far more chilling form when she died.
By the 1960s, Barbara Payton was no longer a headline, she was a cautionary whisper. Her fall from stardom had not only taken her career, it stripped her of stability, of dignity, and finally of visibility. She moved through Los Angeles like a ghost wearing the memory of a former life, drifting between cheap rooms, surviving on whatever kindness or chaos came her way, and carrying the weight of an industry that had devoured her and then pretended she had never existed. At just 39 years old, Barbara died quietly in a run-down apartment, alone, ill, and far removed from the lights that once defined her. But as tragic as her final days were, the true darkness began after she died. Her body was taken to the morgue, paperwork was processed, a routine cremation followed. And then, something broke in the story, something that still cannot be cleanly explained. There is no confirmed grave, no public memorial, no stone for admirers to touch, no plot for historians to visit, no marker acknowledging that she ever existed.
Her ashes were supposedly released to someone, but to whom? No clear record, no verified custodian, no documented location. The final trace of Barbara Payton, the physical proof that a human being once lived, breathed, suffered, and dreamed, simply dissolved into administrative haze. It is one thing to die forgotten. It is another to have your remains disappear, unclaimed or unrecorded, as though the world itself decided that even in death you were best left unwritten. In a city that erects monuments to myth, Barbara Payton became something far more haunting, a star without a burial, a woman whose final chapter is a void.
When the official paperwork ends, the shadows begin. For most public figures, even forgotten ones, there is something left behind. A grave, a niche, a marked urn, a documented handover of ashes. But with Barbara Payton, every trail splits, blurs, or stops entirely, leaving only questions that refuse to settle. There are theories, none proven, all unsettling. 1. Lost in the system. Some suggest her ashes were treated like those of an unclaimed body, stored temporarily, then quietly disposed of with others who died in poverty. If this is true, Barbara Payton, once photographed under studio lights, may have been reduced to an anonymous line in an incineration log. A disappearance not by conspiracy, but by indifference. 2. Taken by someone unknown. Another possibility, someone retrieved her ashes without making it public. A friend, a distant relative, someone who once cared but chose silence over ceremony. This theory raises its own question. Why hide her final resting place? Shame? Privacy? Or simply the belief that no one would come looking?
3. A bureaucratic erasure. Then there is the darkest hypothesis, not rooted in scandal, but in quiet institutional decisions. Her death was considered tragic, sordid, embarrassing for the Hollywood machine, and in that embarrassment the minimal effort was made. Records were filed poorly, custody was unclear. Her ashes slipped from one hand, then another, and finally into the fog of forgotten paperwork. Not erased deliberately, but erased effectively. 4. The silence itself. Perhaps the most chilling twist is not what happened to her remains, but that no one in power ever cared enough to ask. In the absence of a grave, a marker, or even a documented witness to the final transfer of her ashes, Barbara Payton becomes something far more haunting than a fallen star. A reminder of how completely Hollywood can let a person vanish when their story no longer serves the mythology. The mystery is not a dramatic conspiracy. It is the quiet, merciless efficiency of forgetting.
Barbara Payton's life ended long before her body did. Hollywood had already erased her from its screens, from its contracts, from its conversations, years before she took her final breath. But the most haunting part of her story is not the fall, not the scandal, not even the loneliness of her last days. It is the void that followed. A star who once commanded attention, left behind no place to be remembered. No marked grave, no public memorial, no recorded resting site for her ashes. Her disappearance from the physical world mirrors her disappearance from Hollywood's memory, a vanishing so complete that it feels intentional, even if it wasn't. She slipped through the cracks of the system, through the gaps of paperwork, through the apathy of those who once praised her beauty, until even her remains became a question without an answer.
Barbara Payton's story forces us to confront a truth Hollywood rarely admits. The industry that builds legends can also bury people in silence. And sometimes, it buries them so deeply that the world never notices they are gone. In the end, she becomes a symbol of a darker kind of fame. Not the fame that immortalizes, but the fame that disappears. A star without a grave, a life without closure, a body without a place in the world it once dazzled. And somewhere in that silence, in that blank space where a memorial should be, lies the most unsettling question of all. If even a star can vanish without a trace, what hope do the rest of us have of being remembered at all?